Growing up, I was a pretty quiet kid. At home, I was loud, talkative, obnoxious, energetic, as most children are. But when I got outside the home, when I stepped outside, I was a totally different person. I was quiet, I was reserved, I was pretty shy, keeping my ideas and thoughts to myself. Now, when I got to middle school and high school, this actually worked in my favor because most teachers actually preferred quieter students, students that didn't talk as much or didn't disrupt the class. And I was that kind of student. That was me. And so I did well. I got good grades and all of that. And then I went to college and started enrolling in smaller classes oriented around discussion where you had to be vocal, where you had to contribute, where you had to talk. Essentially, I was graded on how much I could talk. And as you can imagine, my grades started to slip. I wasn't doing so well. I would go into every discussion group, every discussion class with thoughts about what I wanted to share, with things that I wanted to say. But after an hour, 60 minutes, when class was over, I left having not opened my mouth once. And I realized that this was a behavior that I would have to change. This was a behavior that I would have to change. All of us have behaviors. All of us have certain behaviors. A lot of them are good. Some of you exercise regularly, eat really well. We don't want you to change any of those behaviors. But some of you, maybe you don't exercise all that well. Maybe you have poor dietary habits. And I bet you at some point you've thought, hey, I'd really like to change that behavior. Bad behaviors, especially unhealthy behaviors, people want to change all the time because they're easy to recognize, but the reality is that they're actually very difficult to change. How many of you have struggled with worry? You end up worrying a lot. And as a result, you get a little bit more agitated, you get a little bit more panicky, your anxiety level raises up, and you want to change that. And people tell you to change. They might say something like, hey, calm down, or stop worrying, or hey, don't worry. That's like the worst thing to tell a worrier, calm down. That's the most uncalming thing to say to someone. It usually doesn't work. It's not very easy to change that behavior. For me, I tried to change my behavior in class of trying to speak up a little bit more. My friends and my professors, they would say, hey, Chris, just speak up. Just say whatever's on your mind. Just speak up. And I was so frozen by that. I had stuff I wanted to say. I would even tell myself, hey, remember to say this. But as soon as I was about to open my mouth to say it, there was something in my mind that said, that's not a very smart thing to say. That's not very insightful, Chris, so just keep your mouth shut. Or that's not very valuable. Someone else already said that. You don't have to say that. And I was constantly thinking about the perfect thing to say. And as a result, I ended up saying nothing at all. I was frozen like that. So as a result, I ended up actually talking to a counselor about how I could get myself to be a little bit more vocal in my discussion classes. And as I'm telling him my story, he says, Chris, hey, we can talk about some strategies to address your behavior. But then he said this, there's actually something deeper going on. Because behind every behavior is a belief. And behind every unhealthy behavior is a false belief. And Chris, if you want to change the unhealthy behavior, then first you got to change the false belief behind it. If you want to change the unhealthy behavior, then first you have to change the false belief behind it. We all subscribe to some false beliefs. And these beliefs were often influenced by our parents, by our peers, by our friends, and often at a very early age, maybe through an event. For example, many of you moved around during your childhood years for whatever reason. And as a result, you ended up having to say a lot of hellos and meeting a lot of new people, but then also having to say a lot of goodbyes and saying goodbye to a lot of people, a lot of relationships that you invested in. And it got to a point where you started feeling, if I get close to someone, I'm eventually going to get hurt. So you developed this false belief that I must not risk intimacy to be safe. And that false belief then led to an unhealthy behavior of I have to close off my feelings. So every time you moved, you closed off your feelings, and you were never able to develop long-lasting, healthy relationships. Here's another example that I know most of us have probably experienced. The idea of receiving approval after performing well. How many of you received approval from your parents or a loved one after you performed well? Which also meant that if you didn't perform well, you were met with disappointment or ridicule. Well, if that's the case, then it's a no-brainer that you'd subscribe to the false belief that you had to perform to be loved. That's the false belief. I must perform to be loved. And as a result, you would develop a behavior of working to gain acceptance. And that behavior then takes fruit in your life and all the different relationships that you've had, with your significant other, with your family, with your spouse, maybe even with your kids. For me, my family comes from Korea, and we immigrated to the States when I was 2. So for our family, English was a second language, especially for my parents. At home we would speak Korean and English and all that, but when we went outside, they had a difficult time communicating. And now I realize that, there's tons of challenges around communication for them and all that kind of stuff. But I would remember when we would go to a restaurant, my parents would order something, and the waiter would bring a different entree, something that we didn't order. And my parents would never send it back. They'd never call the waiter back over because they were always afraid of making a mistake in the conversation with the waiter. They weren't confident with their mastery of the English language. And so they would eat there, eating something that they did not want to eat, eating something that they never ordered, all because they didn't want to make a mistake, all because they were unwilling to contribute to a conversation that would have made things right, but they weren't sure about it. They didn't want to make that mistake. I remember my dad, he never had very long conversations with customer service representatives on the phone. He would always ask them to send him a letter to communicate whatever it is that they were communicating. Because with the letter, he could sit down for hours upon end with letter in hand and the Korean English dictionary in the other hand, and he could write his response perfectly without a mistake, looking up every word that he didn't know. That was him. So for me, as a kid, it got ingrained in me that I should only speak up, that I should only contribute, that I should only be vocal if I knew I wasn't going to make a mistake, that if I knew I was going to say something insightful, that if I knew I was going to say something perfect. For me, the false belief was I must be perfect to know I am of value. I must be perfect to know I am of value, which then led to the unhealthy behavior of perfectionism. I'm still that today. And that's what I saw in college. My inability to speak up in my discussion classes was because I was always wrestling with this idea that I had to say something perfectly, that my idea had to be mistake-free, that if I was going to contribute to something, it had to be something brilliant or genius. That was my false belief, which led to my unhealthy behavior. So that brings us back to the beginning. How do we change our behaviors? How do we change our behavior? We realize that in order to change our behavior, we have to change our belief. Or really, to change any of our unhealthy behaviors, we have to change our false beliefs. So whether it's perfectionism, whether you worry a lot, whether you are prone to really angry outbursts, whatever the unhealthy behavior is, in order to change that, we have to first change the false belief behind it. We need to identify and address this before we are able to change the behavior. We've got to change the false belief. The Bible actually has a lot of insight to that. The Bible calls that renewing your mind, renewing your mind. In Romans 12:2, the Apostle Paul has this great thing. He says, don't conform to the pattern of this world. Don't be ruled by that unhealthy behavior, but instead, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Address the belief that then affects the behavior. So when you hear a passage like this, you realize there's a lot going on in our minds. Because it's our minds that shape our beliefs. It's our mind that shape our beliefs, which then shape our behaviors and our emotions. So I think it's pretty safe to say there is a lot going on up here. At least for some of us, there's a lot going on up here. It's like a battle exists And we need to constantly be renewing our mind. So for me, I still struggle with this even to today. And I imagine I'll probably struggle with it for most of my life, this unhealthy behavior towards perfectionism. Because somewhere along the line, it got ingrained in me, this false belief that I had to be perfect. This false belief that my value came from what I do versus the truth, which is my value comes from who I am. You know, a person loved by God, a child of God.